We are now going to create some textures to use for our buildings. Something we'll be able to randomize and place throughout the city. So what I want to do is add in just a object plane, set the width segments to 1 and the height to 1. And I'm also going to create a top camera, so add a camera, switch it to the top projection, switch over to the camera, and then we can just size this to be about the size of a window. Add in a cloner object from the MoGraph menu, add the plane to this cloner, switch it over to the grid array, one clone on the Y. And then I'm also going to switch over to my render setting output and change the width to 1000 and the height to 1000. We can go back and just position these to pretty much fill up our view. Trying to create the tiling or the edges to be seamless so that our spacing is going to be equal throughout. So now we can add some additional clones. And we could start with that. We could easily render that out and use it to create different windows. But I want some more randomness with it as well. Something we'll be able to use if we wanted to have a night shot and have different lighting situation. So to render this out as it is right now, to be able to use this for Windows, what I would do is add a tag to the cloner object, a compositing tag, and go into the object buffer, checking on object buffer 1, go over to the render settings, turn on the multipass, right click on multipass and add the object buffer, which is automatically set to 1, or you can go to multipass down at the bottom here and add a buffer. So now if we, I am going to go back, set the anti-aliasing to best. Even though this is square, it really doesn't need to be anti-aliased, but just in case, we'll do 1x4. And then we can go ahead and render this out. And if we go to the layer, within the picture viewer, single pass, we can see the object buffer. So we have a nice alpha we can use. So this is going to automatically create our alpha and where the windows are. So we can really do what we want with the color and not lose the position or placement of any of the windows. So since we do have an initial color mode for the cloner, we're going to go to the Transform tab of the cloner object and change the color to something more of a yellowish orange to begin with. And now we want to use additional effectors in order to modify the color. So we add a random effector and drag it to our effectors list on the cloner object if it wasn't selected. Turn off position, turn on the color mode. Right now it's just showing random colors. If we turn on the use alpha strength, we can switch through some of these different ones. We can set up a user defined color. If we want to do black, then we can subtract. It looks like multiply is going to work best for this. And then modify this effector minimum maximum values to subtract different lights. You could use different blending modes. So now when we render this, we've got a nice color, and then we still have our object buffer we can use. So if we want to save this out, we can go to File, Save As, and actually we do need to make sure that under Layer, actually it's not going to matter in this case if we have layers turned on, because we really only have the alpha and then the color. So I would save this as a TIFF PSD layers with the alpha channel, which is our object buffer. Then we have a color as the top, and then our other. And I would really use this to overlay with an alpha on top of another material. But let's take a look at expanding this a little bit further. Most window or lights that would be on within a city, kind of really office spaces, and most companies tend to own specific floors. So you'd really see floors of lights on rather than it being just completely random. You'd really see more strips of things. So in this case, it would be easier to use shader reflector. So we're going to select the cloner, add a shader reflector. Under the parameter, make sure that the scale is turned off or any of the transform modes. The color mode is set to on. We're just going to set it to subtract for now. Go to shading, add in a noise. And then what we can do is reduce scales here. Right now I have the X set to 0. We could turn off the random effector for the moment, just so we can see the effects of this shader. Increase our contrast, and then turn the random back on. We really don't have enough objects here or windows to be able to see the strips clearly enough. So I'm going to go to the plane, and in the model mode, just scale that down. And then in the cloner object, increase the amount of clones. And then if we go to our shader effector, we can set up our minimum and maximum values. And depending on which mode we have set, whether we're subtracting or dividing, those sliders will give completely different results if they apply anything at all. So you can see there are a lot of different setups you can get. But we do have more strip type lights showing. It looks like that shader effector may not be scaled small enough. So we can go to the overall amount and scale that down. Maybe take our brightness and adjust the settings a little. We can clip it if needed. With the high clip and the low clip. And also, we do have a seed option. So we can change the seed, and that way you can create random textures you can render out. Or one thing you could do is animate the seed over time. Right-click, animation, add a keyframe, drag the timeline, which I don't have up in my interface right now. Drag the timeline to a different frame. Change the seed, right-click, animation, add a keyframe, and then render out the animation, so that we can create a bunch of different textures all at once to choose from. If we go back, we do need to change the blending mode. Use the alpha strength. And if we set the blending mode to multiply with the color mode just set to on or divide, we can really get a lot of different variations. And then going into the cloner and under the effectors list, we can also use these different sliders to adjust the overall impact. So another thing we could do is if we wanted to create groups of multiple windows, we could switch our cloner over to cluster and turn off fixed clone, copy and paste the object plane, and with fixed clone turned off we can move these objects and still have them cloned, and cluster keeps them clones both of these objects per individual spot or placement. So going back, if we turn on fixed clone, those plane will be just moved back to its object axis point to fix to the instance area in the instance position. And then if we turn off cluster, we're going to see it switch in between the different modes. So you can see the ends just have the single because we're really just kind of skipping one or two, and it's really not the two side by side in an exact way, although we do get more coloration that way. Go back to cluster, and I'm going to reduce the amount of clones, add a little more separation. So we could add another object too if we wanted to have a group of 3 windows. Select our camera if we need to and move it around. Get that to fit a little bit better. So that's kind of a cool way you can create a nice little render setup here and be able to choose from different clones. You could also create multiple cloner objects, and one with a single window, one with more than one. Now, I'm going to go ahead and save this as it is, but I've already created a much more useful scene for creating this. And I do have this as a user object preset, so I'm going to create a new scene and load in my window controller. And I just need to add in camera, set it to the top view, and what I've done is set up a null object with some user data connected to the objects inside. So I can choose between a single window, a set of double windows, and a set of 3 windows. I can also change the scale of the random noise that's inside of it, set up some different colorized options, minimum maximum values, different blending modes, and then also change the seed. So this is set up with an Espresso, and these are all the objects inside. If you take a look at the Espresso editor, this is what I've set up to control it based on those options within the null. And this is actually pretty easy to set up. If you're not familiar with the Espresso, it can seem a little daunting, but once you understand a few things about it, a setup like this is really quite easy. So I've just gone back and opened up the scene we just created just to show you how you can set up a little controller like I did. First, what I want to do is just add a duplicate cloner. So copy and paste, and then just remove the copy of the clone and set this up for single windows. So now we have 2 different ones to choose from. Now one thing is when you're turning these on and off, any objects contained within the cloner, even if you turn the cloner off, will show up within the render and the viewport unless you set your visible and editor and render options to off. or check these options here. So one thing you can do is just control that with a null object or the user's interface. So first thing I'm going to do is create a null object, call it controller, right click, and add in the espresso tag. What we can do is now choose what objects we want to clone or what objects we want to control and how we want to control them. So this little check on and off is the enabled option. So what we want to do is first add in these two cloners. And we're going to find those options. We're going to click over here in the blue part, go to Basic Properties, and select Enabled. And now what we're going to do is go to the cloner object, and under Enabled, what we can do is copy, or right-click, and go to Copy User Data Interface. We go to the controller. From the Attributes menu, there is a User Data option. We can add user data. This is going to insert in a checkbox into a new tab and open up the Manage User Data interface where we can give this a name. We want one for each cloner, so we will call this, first one is going to be single windows. Now if we go to the controller, under user data, we have single windows. And it does show up as the wrong kind of option. It was supposed to be a checkbox. So we're going to go back really quick and double check something here. And we're going to paste user data because it looks like I just added user data instead of pasting it. So you do need to paste it in order to get the right kind of control. The connection isn't made automatically, but the control becomes available. So what we can do is delete that single window, go to the enabled, and call this single windows. So now we have that checkbox. If we go back into the Espresso editor, we can now drag the controller object into our workspace, and under the red, which is going to be our output, we're going to select user data, single windows. And our cloner object point 1 is the single window, so what we can do is just drag that onto there. Go to the main viewport. And now we can turn it on and off with this checkbox. So we also want another control. And what we can do is just copy user data interface, paste it. Actually, I'm going to hit cancel because otherwise it's going to be confusing to know which one's which. I'm going to recopy the user data interface from that enabled. Go back to the controller, paste user data, rename it double windows, and then that becomes available in that user data list. Now we also need it to be able to turn off those render settings, and we can just use that same checkbox. So those settings are basic properties and visible in editor and visible in renderer. So we're going to use that for both. And what we can do is drag those options directly onto the connection from the same checkbox. Now I'm just going to do one at the moment. And the reason is it is going to be incorrect for the moment. If we go back to the controller, what we're going to see is the reverse option. And if we take a look right here, when the cloner object is currently on, the render options and views are turned off. So we need it to invert and do the exact opposite. This is pretty easy to set up. All we need to do is right-click, add a new node, go to Espresso, and under Bool, we're going to select Not. And we're going to add another one. One for each. So we'll just connect this bottom one first. And then up here we can just click on those connections to delete them. Connect that top switch. Drag these over. Go back to the main viewport, controller, and now it's going to work correctly. So we can turn and choose which windows we want on or off. And it automatically sets up our render settings correctly. Now what we can also do is right-click, edit entry to pull that window back up. If we want to add a group, we can rename this group clones. Making sure that we don't hit enter because it will close out the window. We're going to move that up to the top, and we can drag these options into that group. So now we have something we can expand or close out. So that is what I did in order to create this object, and if I also saved it out as a object preset. So with the null selected file, save object preset, and then it becomes available under your user load object preset. You can load it in any scene. So I've added, of course, additional options. I have for the shaders, there are two different noises connected to the same seed. And I have some of the blending modes extracted, a couple of different options. You can look at the editor and see how those were created. I did have to separate the shader effectors channel to get the seed and use those on separate nodes, and also add in a noise, an absolute value, in order to get the seed to show up correctly. I also added a multiply into one of the connections where it's multiplying the number by 2 in order to create a different seed value for the noise. So entering one seed, it doubles the value for the seed of the other shader. So there's two different shaders. But I did have to end up using separate nodes because the way the connection was, it wasn't really working. So even though shader effector is in the list and showing up twice, it was the only real way I could get the blending modes to work properly. My Espresso knowledge is fairly limited, so not entirely certain why that is. I think it's just because the way the connections are set up and the way I set up the noises, but it does work for the most part. So a couple of different controls, and you can see which controls what by going through the nodes and seeing the different controls. We can edit the entry, right-click, edit entry, in order to see all of these different settings. I don't have all of them named for the different cloners, but feel free to play around with this, and including it with the training. You can use it to customize different windows. The only thing I did not add is the compositing tag with the object buffer. So I will create a new object for that with the object buffer. And if you want, you can also use the two different groups together, or different sets of cloners together, customizing them, because you can still go in and modify all of these settings and have different object buffers to create the separations. I do want to note that whenever you connect something with Espresso, and you have this controller, you are no longer able to apply the settings within the editor. So I'm trying to turn this cloner object off. It's not letting me because it is controlled by this checkbox. So that's just one thing to keep in mind. It will take control. So I'm going to go ahead and render out some different textures using this controller, and between renders just changing some of these settings in order to get different textures out of it, different things we can use. If needed, increasing the clone amount in order to get more windows, more variation to choose from. And then we'll proceed and start applying those to the different clones and take a look at some of the MoGraph shader effectors.